Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Well, it was a nice night to provide pizza, so we didn't have to go out in what I just came in from was some really heavy rain for a while, and I think more is on the way. So, well, I hope everything's going well. I see from the video in there, we're at the midpoint of the summer, and it's all downhill from here. In a good way, in a good way. You can coast to the end. Some of you had exams today, I understand. I hope those went well. And maybe we'll get some cooler weather soon. I hope everyone's going to enjoy the 4th of July. Get to the fireworks if you can. They're always exceptional here in Washington, D.C. And just have a wonderful, safe weekend. Tonight is one of my favorite evenings of the summer. It is this year, the 2025 Neil B. Freeman Lecture. The annual lecture is intended to recognize courageous and eloquent oratory that enriches the exchange of ideas in the public square. Neil Freeman was an award-winning journalist, author, and entrepreneur who served on the TFAS board from 1998 to 2002 and continued to advise us in many capacities after that as a trustee emeritus. Among his books are Skirmishes and Walk With Me, An Invitation to Faith. He had a distinguished career that included serving as the producer of the longest-running PBS television program, Firing Line. Delivering our Freeman Lecture tonight is Lord Daniel Hannan of Kingsclere. Daniel Hannan has been a member of the UK House of Lords since 2021 and serves as the Conservative Party's International Secretary. He's written 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Inventing Freedom: How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. He sat as a member of the European Parliament in Brussels for 21 years, and there he founded the Vote Leave campaign. He's a regular columnist for the Sunday Telegraph, the Washington Examiner, the Daily Mail, and other publications. I know that while in the European Parliament, on a couple of occasions at least, his speeches to the Parliament went viral globally. So you're in for a treat in hearing him speak tonight. He's also president of the Institute for Free Trade. His topic tonight, which we've asked him to speak on, is 250 years of freedom, what the American tradition means to the world. When he finishes his talk, we hope to have time for some questions, but he's got a vote in the House of Lords tomorrow afternoon, so I've got to get him to the airport for a flight back to London pretty quickly after he finishes. So, but we'll do our best to have time to entertain some questions. But that's why we wanted to get this started promptly. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Daniel Hannan.
Well, Roger, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm here to talk about the Declaration of Independence and what it means to the rest of us, but I was hit by a moment of sudden enlightenment today, an epiphany, a moment of gnosis, if you will, which is, I reckon we left because of the weather. I mean, I was sweltering this afternoon just before the thunderstorm broke, and I suddenly understood why it was that the British thought, well, you know, we can find somewhere more clement than this. We'll carve out a different empire somewhere less harsh. And so as they sweltered under the slowly swaying punkahs in Bengal, or as they trekked across the searing sands of the Sudan, or as they marched over the dry, patched red earth of the Australian outback, they consoled themselves with the thought that it was still a lot more temperate than the banks of the Potomac in July. So, but I wanted to take you back actually to a different July, and this one not here, but in the old courthouse in Philadelphia. And I want you to imagine this time of year, the hot light streaming through those tall windows into that old brick building. and the greater intensity of heat inside because of what was happening. As the men felt their stockings sticking to their legs, as they felt beads of sweat from under their powdered white wigs, they understood that they were on the cusp of doing something of planetary significance. There was, as it's reported, a little moment of silence before the signing, and then John Hancock was the first, wasn't he? He wrote his signature in an enormous, big swirl. He said, "I want old King George to be able to read this without his spectacles." And in that moment, the world experienced a little secular miracle. A dream of freedom was turned into a functioning nation. A nation that attracted tens of millions of settlers from every continent and every archipelago, and went on to plant its flag on the moon. A nation founded in an idea that went on to carry the loftiest hopes of all mankind. One way of judging the success of the US Constitution is its sheer longevity. Do you know, one of the things that has always astonished me about this country is how Americans persist in thinking of it as a young country. They are attached to this idea of themselves as rough frontiers people. But actually, just as a nation state, this is, definitely in the older bracket. Older, of course, than anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere, older than almost anywhere in Africa, most places in Asia, actually older than most countries in Europe, older than Italy, older than Germany, as a nation, right? If we mean as a regime, one continuous form of government, then you're probably able to count with your fingers the states that are older than this one. And I want you just to dwell on that for a second. I was born in Lima, Peru, in my native South America. There have been, in the time that you have had one constitution, there have been more than 200. Right? Now, how is that? And what is the connection between the authority and the legitimacy bestowed on this regime by the longevity of its founding charter and the fact that there is such a one-way traffic of people in the Western Hemisphere? There is a reason that no Mexican politician has to propose building a wall to keep all the Americans out, right? And it's not to do with climate or cuisine, it's to do with political structures. Well, I was thinking about how to celebrate, what should I say coming up to this great 250th anniversary, and I turned back to what that great and underrated President Calvin Coolidge had said exactly 100 years ago, coming up to the 150th. And I think he put it beautifully. He said, it's about the longest sentence the guy ever spoke consecutively. He said, amid all the clash of conflicting interests, amid all the welter of parties and politics, every American can turn for solace and consolation to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, with the assurance and confidence that those two great charters of freedom and justice remain firm and unshaken. That's it. That's the magic formula. Above politics is something bigger. Above the politicians is something that you can't see or hear or touch, but that binds the chief executive as surely as it binds the ordinary citizen. And the very fact of it existing for so long, sure, in the physical form of a piece of desiccated parchment on the walls of the National Archives that you've probably seen while you were here, but existing as an idea that government is there as a servant, that the politicians are not rulers, that they are there fundamentally to preserve the Constitution, that there is a reason why office holders and not the rest of you take an oath to preserve the Constitution. That is what has distinguished this country from every other country in the hemisphere and pretty much every other country in the world. Think about it. North and South America was settled around about the same time. Right? There was no obvious geographical advantage in the northern part of the hemisphere. Right? Nor was there any particular advantage in wealth or power when you compare Spain to England at that time. As the great historian Macaulay said, the Castilian was the superior in every way of the Englishman at the beginning of the 16th century. So what explains the difference? Well, I think that the settlers brought here a treasure that was more valuable than all the silver in the mines of Potosi. And this was that they had a way of organizing their affairs, of spreading power diversely, of electing local leaders, sheriffs, mayors, and all the rest of it, which made it feasible for them to run and operate a free society in a way that was unthinkable to an empire that was still trying to be run from the Escorial in Spain. They had a toolkit, if you like, of the common law, of localism, of dispersed, decentralized, and democratized decision-making that outlasted and outperformed every rival model. And that, in the end, is why the world tends to communicate in the language in which you are speaking, in which you're listening to me. Now, those things were maintained not just by a constitution, but by a whole habit of thought that goes around it. The constitution, if you like, was the expression, it was the formal written form of a culture that said the rules are above the ruler. The guy in charge doesn't get to make things up as he goes along, which is an extraordinary and revolutionary idea. But in the minds of the founders, this went back a long way. They didn't think that they were inventing it in a vacuum. They looked back through the English Bill of Rights, back to the Great Charter, back even before that, to the folk right of Anglo-Saxon common law, this idea of a legal system that is vested in the people and is not a tool of the government, but is rather a preserver of the liberties of ordinary folk. It's a folk right of common law. Now, you might think it takes a certain chutzpah for a British politician to come here on the eve of Independence Day and start claiming the US Constitution as some kind of joint patrimony of the English-speaking peoples. I plead in my partial defense that this is what Churchill did. But surely you might say, how can I do it on this, coming up to this most special time of year? I mean, after all, didn't Paul Revere thunder through the townships of eastern Massachusetts, warning everyone that the British were coming? And didn't Washington cross the Delaware, waving that great Stars and Stripes flag, and establish an independent country? Well, actually, as a matter of fact, no, neither of those things happened, at least not in the way that they are remembered. Think for a second about the flaw in the Paul Revere story, right? And we've all known the story since the poem, right? That he rides out saying the British are coming and everyone gets ready and there's the confrontation and the shot is heard around the world. At that time, it would not have occurred to anyone in Massachusetts that they were anything other than British, right? So it would have been an unusual thing to shout. I was talking to a couple of people earlier who are studying in Manchester. So you'll know that there are some pretty strange people in Massachusetts, but even in Massachusetts, it would be an extraordinary thing and very eccentric to shout, the British are coming, to a completely British population. Actually, what Paul Revere actually shouted was, the regulars are out, or in one version, the redcoats are out, because he was continuing, in his mind, this story of resistance to overweening central authority that went back a long way. There was a defining characteristic of the nationality of Englishmen at that time, that they saw themselves as having rights that went beyond the power of the state, that liberties were not given, they were taken. And that's why in the minds of a lot of the founders, they were not really revolutionaries at all, they were conservatives. They were standing up for the rights that they assumed they had been born with as British subjects, against the depredations of a foreign king. Now, of course, once independence had become a fact, people started writing all sorts of stories differently. And now if you go to Lexington and Concord, you'll have the tour guide saying, well, the British were here and the Americans were here. Terms that would, of course, have been completely meaningless to the participants at that time. It was to them very clearly a civil war within a single polity about which side should come out on top. But as the great historian Ernest Renan said, getting your history wrong is part of what makes you a nation. I'm fascinated. Every country in the world does this, and I'm fascinated in what that tells us. I was talking to somebody earlier about the famous picture of Washington crossing the Delaware, right? You've all seen it. And I mean, there is so much wrong with that picture. I mean, just first of all, like you would not stand up in a boat like that; it would fall over, right, into the river that couldn't have had those kind of ice flows in it. But the really interesting thing about that picture is who else is in the boat with him, and this is where you see a kind of very early version of identity politics, because in that rowing boat with the general are three people who, given their ethnicity, would almost certainly have been on the other side. One is a Scottish Highlander wearing a tam o' shanter hat. There were Scottish Highland populations along the Hudson River and in the Carolinas, and they were the most hardline loyalists. They fought harder than anyone else. They really actually meant it. It was actually the Independence War was a surprisingly low casualty episode. 7,000 fatalities, I think, over the whole 8 years. It was nothing like what happened in contemporary European wars. About the only people on the loyalist side who actually believed in it and fought accordingly were those former Jacobites who'd been settled following demobilization, and they were not going to live in a Protestant republic. In fact, they fought so hard that Jefferson had to be made to take an explicit attack on Scotland out of the first Declaration of Independence draft, because he was so angry with them at the time. But this was a way of saying to all Americans of Scots descent, it's all right, you're part of the family now. It doesn't matter which side your ancestors were on at the time. Next to the Highlander, there is a black American. Again, which side were African Americans on during that campaign? Of course, both sides, like with anything, you can find exceptions. But overwhelmingly, they were, perfectly understandably, for the side that had promised to end slavery. And then there's a Native American. Again, whose side were they going to be on? Which side was saying, don't expand the frontier, respect the treaties with the Aboriginal inhabitants? I love little details like that, because we sometimes think that in a mad moment of political correctness, we are the generation that has invented identity politics. In fact, there were kind of flickers, premonitions of wokery, even back in 1851 when that painting was composed. But although I claim a certain common heritage among the free English-speaking democracies, what happened that hot day in Philadelphia took things much further. And I think actually the guy who put this best was Tocqueville. Tocqueville is very often remembered, and particularly quoted here, as a prophet of American exceptionalism. But he wrote a great deal about England as well. His wife was British. He lived for some time in the UK. And his great theory was that the populations who had come from the old world to the new were able to forge kind of exaggerated forms of their old societies in the air of the Western Hemisphere. So in his view, just as Spanish America replicated and intensified the ramshackle corruption of Philip's Spain, and just as French America, as he saw it, exaggerated the seigneurialism and obscurantism of Bourbon France, so English America, as he always called it, was more libertarian and more localist and more republican because people had the greater freedom in the wide spaces of the New World. As he put it in what I've always thought is one of the most touching lines in his whole canon, he said, "The American is the Englishman left to himself." And that really was the formula that made this extraordinary document and has preserved this extraordinary republic for 2.5 centuries. A lot of it was a happy accident of timing. The US happened to draw up its foundational documents at the moment when there was maximum emphasis in Western political thought on the rights of the individual, on freedom and property. All states, all unions grow according to the DNA that is encoded at the moment of their foundation. I'll illustrate this by drawing a parallel between the founding documents of this republic and those of the European Union. You heard Roger say in introducing me that I served as a member of the European Parliament for 21 years. The Declaration of Independence, all of you know, promises life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? The EU's equivalent, which is called the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, guarantees people's rights to strike action, affordable housing, and free healthcare. The one document is about general principles, about the rights of the individual and the limitations of government. The other presumes to set policy on absolutely everything from space exploration to the status of asylum seekers. The US Constitution, with all of its amendments, is 7,200 words. The EU Constitution became the Lisbon Treaty, was 164,000 words. And a really interesting thing is to contrast the way in which those two documents were ratified. The US Constitution came into effect following ratification individually in the 13 member states, or at least in most of the 13 member states. I think North Carolina and Rhode Island held out for a little bit until they finally fell into line. The EU began by saying, we will do the equivalent, which is to have referendums, a kind of modern version of the Constitutional Convention. But they found that people kept voting against it. It was rejected in referendums in Ireland, in Denmark, in France, in the Netherlands, and they then imposed it anyway. And the reason for this is because deep down, this republic, being founded in a struggle against a distant and authoritarian government, had a natural sympathy for the diffusion of power, whereas the EU, coming out of the Second World War, had a distrust of democracy that was associated in its founders' minds with fascism and war, and therefore had this converse idea that power should be vested in officials who were immune to public opinion and invulnerable to the ballot box. You are very lucky. Imagine if you were drawing up the US Constitution today, or imagine if you were drafting the Declaration of Independence today. I humbly submit that it would not be the same sublime and elevated set of documents that are hanging there on the wall in the National Archives. Keeping that promise is a constant task. It's not like those original signatories did it once in 1776 and that's it. Things very easily devolve. Things revert to the mean. And it falls on every generation to do its bit. It's as though you've inherited a repairing lease. You've been fortunate enough to inherit this extraordinary constitutional structure that has made this rich, prosperous, free country, that has attracted people and continues to attract them. The in queue is a lot longer than the out queue here, right? But there is a commensurate responsibility to say, just as we have inherited this accreted work of past generations, greater than any single generation could have completed on its own, so we should add to it and improve it and try and pass it on in a better condition. And we should do so by sticking to the fundamental principles which were enshrined, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, the idea that government is by consent, that every individual is due dignity and freedom, and that politics is about reason, about empiricism, that the truth is not something that is handed down by a political or clerical elite, but is something that you can reach through science, through the scientific method, through logic and argument, and you can change people's minds with reason. Now, I've got to ask, how well is that repairing lease going? Do you feel that those things are still being kept up? The idea, for example, of complete equality. The idea that all adult citizens have the same status before the law. See, that's something that I think has to be taught. I don't think that comes naturally. I think the idea of the dignity of every individual, free from their clan or tribe, free from their ancestry or caste, is something that in the sweep of history is exceptional and requires a process of acculturation and education, because we will otherwise slip back into what every pre-modern society was, which is one based on vendetta and tribe. Are we doing that now? I wonder whether in the last 5 or 10 years, some of our schools have not been doing the opposite, have not been encouraging the idea that we are, in fact, defined by accident of birth or caste or physiognomy, have been teaching you that the most important thing, or the most relevant thing anyway, about you is that you're white or female or whatever it is. And that isn't just incompatible with the promise of a free republic, it's incompatible with the ability to maintain an open democracy. Yesterday was the 95th birthday of the great economist Thomas Sowell. He made the sublime observation that you cannot maintain an open society on the basis that two babies arriving in this world on the same day come into it with a set of pre-existing grievances. That's something that has to be taught. It doesn't come naturally. The elevation of process over outcome, right? The readiness to uphold the rules even when they're not working in your favor, that does not come naturally. No early society operated on that basis. I mentioned that I grew up in South America with its 200 constitutions. The reason that it has all those constitutions, the reason the Dominican Republic, I think, has managed 24, Venezuela has had 21, my native Peru is languishing on a mere 12. But the reason why that keeps happening is because deep down people don't believe that the rules are above the rulers. They think that once they're there, they get to define the rules, and it's a quite natural thing to draw up a new constitution so as to enshrine the privileges and ideas that happen to suit you and your family. And not doing that does not come naturally. I think one of the most human desires, and one of the most understandable ones, is to say, where I want to get to matters much more than the route by which I get to it. And even in the United States, one comes across that a great deal. If you tell me where someone stands on the right to life, I will tell you, not with 100% certainty, but with 80 to 90% certainty on where they stand on whether the Supreme Court should legislate on abortion law. Right? Because outcome drives process on both sides. You see, here's a trivial but telling example, telling because trivial. The jurisdictional battles happening now between the federal government and the state of California. Donald Trump dislikes lots of things about the Golden State, most obviously its sanctuary policy, its immigration policy. But also he doesn't like the fact that there's too much DEI in the high schools there. He doesn't like the fact that there was a trans long jumper. He doesn't like the fact that they're promoting electric vehicles. There's a whole bunch of things where he is throwing his weight around and attempting to impose his views. Now, I'm a conservative on most of those issues. I lean towards him and not towards Democrat-run California. It does not follow that he has the right to impose his wishes because process matters. And the dispersal of power was perhaps the key insight of the founders. They understood that if you had jurisdictional competition, if you had the freedom for individual states to pilot new ideas, to trial new schemes, that this would ensure not only that government was more efficient, but also that people were freer, because it would be much harder for autocratic or authoritarian government to develop in a dispersed polity. Both sides, it seemed to me, have been forgetting that. When I was growing up in Peru in the 70s, I used to think that the day will come when South America gets to the North American level of political development, right? Because it's so obviously working better. The population movement is the outward measure of it, but there is a reason why people prefer to live here. It's not because of some magical property in the soil or the sky or the gene pool. It's because the institutions work better and allow people to reach their full potential. And so that will be so obvious that the day will come when Guatemala and Peru and Paraguay and all these other places copy the successful formula. But here's the thing. If anything, the recent movement seems to me to have been in the other direction. Now, you're coming up to this big 250th anniversary. Latin America generally has just been celebrating its 200th anniversaries, right? Most of the countries from Mexico to Argentina became independent at some point between, let's say, 1810 and 1825, right? Almost none of them, as I said earlier, has this continuous single regime constitutionality. Almost none of them has it because people struggle to accept that the rulers are bound by the rules, that the people in charge aren't these father of the nation figures who can do what they want because they have everyone's interests at heart. And the things that are now creeping in to the politics of this republic strike me as actually remarkably South American in their form. For example, the constant demands that you lock up the losers. In fact, the idea of locking up an opposition politician at all. I don't think I'd really heard any serious politician advancing that idea until about 10 years ago here. The idea that the losers automatically go to court, that as soon as a party loses an election, that they try and overturn it in some way. That, again, very normal where I grew up, for people not to accept election results, for them to be treated as contingent, only to count when your side happened to win. But something that until very recently was pretty much unthinkable here, right? And the point I want to make is this. The strange thing is not that people should only care about elections when they win. It's that for the previous 250 years, you amazingly managed not to do that. That people really did give their loyalty to an idea, an invisible, intangible concept, rather than to the flesh and blood leader of their party, of their faction. And the reason that that happened for as long as it did is because there was a process of education. There was a process of explaining to people constantly why that mattered. I want to leave time for questions, so let me end with a story about why this matters to the whole world and not just to the US. I want to take you back this time to yet another summer, but this time to an August day in 1941. It was the day that Franklin Roosevelt made the longest walk of his presidency. In a way that would nowadays be unthinkable, the media of that time had conspired to hide the fact of the president's polio. So every photograph showed him seated or standing unaided. But on that day, 10th of August 1941, he was determined to walk because he was going to see Winston Churchill. They were both on warships. FDR was on the USS Augusta and Churchill on HMS Prince of Wales. And Churchill was playing host. And so Roosevelt decided, supported by his son on one side, by a naval officer on the other, to make the slow walk across the bucking deck of HMS Prince of Wales, while the band of that warship struck up the Stars and Stripes Forever. And what happened afterwards was the most perfect illustration of what bound the English-speaking peoples together and of what made the Allies the good guys in that war. It happened to be a Sunday morning, and so the two crews were mustered together for a joint religious service. Churchill had chosen every detail personally and meticulously, down to the hymns, down to the reading that the chaplain gave from the pulpit on deck. It came from Joshua 2. As I was with Moses, so will I be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage. And afterwards, bursting out in excitement, Churchill exclaimed the same language, the same hymns, the same ideals. And when he said the same ideals, this was not a bland generalization about being the good guys. Think of the world as it stood in August 1941. The whole of the Eurasian landmass, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, was under one kind of authoritarian government or another. Liberty was thrown back to the Anglosphere and a handful of countries in Latin America. The ideas that we now call universal rights became universal, if we're honest about this, because of the readiness of the English-speaking peoples and some allies to defend them with force of arms. The ideas that make our lives comfortable and modern and rational. Ideas like regular elections and uncensored newspapers and equality between men and women and habeas corpus and jury trials. These were overwhelmingly ideals developed in the language in which you're listening to these words. Imagine that the Second World War had ended differently. Or imagine that the Cold War had ended differently. There'd have been nothing universal about them then. And that's why what happens here matters far beyond the borders of the United States. I started with the false quotation from Paul Revere. Let me end with the true quotation of the man who actually sent him on his ride, Dr. Joseph Warren, the president of the Massachusetts Congress, who met his end at Bunker Hill and just before told his fellow patriots, on your decisions depend the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you here who are American citizens have the extraordinary privilege of having inherited from your parents a freer system than any other on the planet. And that carries with it a commensurate responsibility to keep those freedoms intact and to pass them on to the next generation. Act worthy of yourselves. So we've got a little bit of time for questions.
Two microphones, one over here and one over there.
Okay. Yeah. Yep.
Should I ask the question? Thank you for your talk. I read your book, Inventing Freedom, in middle school, and I've been an Anglophile ever since. I must confess, it seems like Brexit was kind of a mistake in hindsight, because it seems like the libertarian case for Brexit made by intelligent people like yourself was that Britain would deregulate its labor and product markets, it would sign a bunch of trade deals, and basically become the Singapore of Europe. This evidently hasn't happened, and so with the benefit of hindsight, do you think Brexit was a mistake?
It hasn't happened yet. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It's a good question. I have been very disappointed by the pace of change. We have been much slower than we should have been to seize both the deregulatory opportunities and the commercial opportunities. We are, I think, the only country to have had any kind of trade deal with the US since, what was it, the 2nd of April, the Liberation Day tariffs. Nonetheless, it's not, it's only a stopgap deal, right? It's a temporary arrangement pending what we hope will be a fuller trade agreement later in the year. Nonetheless, with all of that, we have made some significant steps to have a regulatory regime that more suits our conditions and needs. We've particularly diverged from the EU in the field of tech and AI. When I got my smartphone, it has the Apple Intelligence function on it. None of that is possible in the European Union, which has gone in a much more protectionist direction. We've diverged on things like gene editing. I'm hopeful that we will get a decent trade deal with the US, but in the meantime, we have got a very extensive trade arrangement with the Pacific countries, the 13 nations of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We are the first country to have signed a really serious trade deal with India. So the proof, I guess, is this. Although the current government is staffed and run by people who didn't just campaign against Brexit, but who spent the next 3 years trying to get us back in, now that they're in office and have seen how it works, none of them is actually proposing to go back in. So in that sense, I think the proof is in their behavior. And look, no country ever gets poorer over time as a result of becoming more independent. Your Brexit was exactly 250 years ago. It looks to me like it's working out okay.
I also think the American Revolution was a mistake.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. So the continuation of the U.S. Constitution as the rule of land is really important for the sustainment of our society. However, in order for us to appreciate the Constitution and its role that it plays, we have to be able to raise up patriots to understand why it's so important. I would argue that our civics education system in America is in shambles. So how do you suggest we revive our civics education to raise up patriots who will fight for their country?
Yeah, thank you. Well, actually, just to function in this country, right? I mean, it's a bonus if they then want to rush off and enlist, but actually just to feel that they have enough in common, one with another as Americans, that they will gladly pay taxes to support people that they have. Maybe not gladly, but they will honestly pay taxes to support people they don't know. That they will accept election results when their party loses. That they will obey laws even if they think they're dumb laws, right? These are minimal requirements of citizenship. And you're right, civics is the way, fundamentally, of teaching people that their primary identity has to be as a citizen, as an American, not as a Presbyterian or a Japanese American or whatever it is, right? That all of you, sure, have all those identities, but we have to relate one to another on the basis of equality before the law as fellow citizens. The only distinction is between the citizen and the non-citizen. Now, is that happening? No, I don't think it is. I think there's been a palpable change in the ethos in not just on campus, but in high schools. And I don't see that turning around in a hurry, which is why organizations like this one become so important. Right? Somebody has got to pick up the slack. Somebody has got to convey what, until an eye blink ago, would have gone without saying in this country. It was not a partisan thing. It wasn't something that was questioned. Of course, you needed to have enough in common one with another to accept government from each other's hands if you wanted to be a functioning and successful nation. The US has been unbelievably successful at integrating people from every corner of the world into a vision of shared nationality and identity. Right? Very few countries in Europe, or indeed anywhere else, have managed to do that in the same way, to get this sense of shared patriotism. Doing that means you've got to be kind of pretty blatant about telling people what it is that they are integrating into, right? And the things that the Euro sophists sneer at most, the expressions of American patriotism that make Europeans most uncomfortable, the 4th of July fireworks and the bunting and the flags and so on, that's what makes it so easy for any newcomer to understand what the deal is. Now, I may differ from some people in the audience here. I actually am a great Reaganite on immigration. The Gipper had a lovely phrase once where he said, every immigrant makes America more American. Right? There's very few countries where you could say that. And it wasn't even controversial when he said it. Everyone thought it was a beautiful phrase, but nobody really disagreed, right? Imagine any leading politician daring to stand up and express that sentiment now. But you know what? I have to say, if I look at the history of this republic, there has never been a moment when the popular attitude to immigration has not been basically suspicious. If you do a snapshot in 1800 or 1850 or 1900 and 1950, the argument is always, yeah, it's been great until now, but this time it's different, right? And there's always some new factor that plausibly makes it, yeah, but up until now, they all spoke English. Yeah, up until now, they were all Protestants. Yeah, up until now, they were all white, right? And every time that argument is made, it's been falsified in the event. And so I am really optimistic, but it does depend on continuing to have a civic rather than an ethnic conception of nationhood, which means that you've got to transmit those values. So thank you for your question. And it's up to TFAS and a handful of allied organizations. Actually, a little round of applause for the people who are doing it, by the way, if you wouldn't mind, guys, because they are remedying the deficiencies of the public education system. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Hi. So I really like your appeals to kind of following tradition. I was just going to ask about one kind of appeal to traditional parts. Technically speaking, the Senate and the House are still supposed to operate with a 3 readings process, which you are very well aware in the British Parliament. How much would you say that would be very beneficial to recommitting to that, to deliberative processes in the United States? Yeah,
look, I mean, I am all in favor of returning to the schemata set out in the Constitution, right? I think that the founders knew what they were doing when they put Congress in Article 1 and the presidency in Article 2. Right? So if I just focus narrowly on the issue of trade, it is absolutely clear that is a congressional jurisdiction. There is no conceivable reading of the Constitution that doesn't lead you to that conclusion. But successive Congresses, for low and dishonorable reasons, have handed that power away because on one specific issue, on one occasion, they wanted to get a win, and then they find that they can't get it back afterwards. And what goes for commerce goes across the range of things. So I would really like to return to something much closer to the practice of I guess if Jefferson or Madison had come back, I think even under Grover Cleveland, they'd have still recognized the system. Right? I think it started to diverge a bit under the first Roosevelt, and it then diverged a lot more under Wilson and so on, and now it would be almost unrecognizable. And I find it hard to improve on the great P.J. O'Rourke, who said, yeah, the Constitution may be an imperfect document, but it's a hell of a lot better than what we've got now. Yeah.
So after Pope Francis died and through conclave, it seemed like a lot of the media attention was on what was happening with the Catholic Church. But the Archbishop of Canterbury has been a vacant position for 6 months, and it seems a lot of people don't even know.
Long time, no see.
Is the Anglican Church in decline? And if so, what does that mean for the UK and the rest of the world?
It's a very good question. So the Church of England has basically been in decline from the beginning. I don't think it's a bit like the US attitudes to immigration. There's never been a moment when people haven't said, "Oh, this church attendance is falling and people are leaving it," and there's I guess as with the immigration thing, there's an element of truth. You don't get many converts to the Church of England. Let me put it like that. It does happen, but it's like converts to Judaism. It's an unusual and laborious process. It can happen, but it's not numerically significant. I'm a member of the Anglican communion, and I'm not just a tick box. I go to church in my village. One of the things that we are familiarized by long exposure to, and so we stop thinking how weird it is the theological basis of the Church of England, which claims to be the only legitimate church. The argument that was put forward by Hooker and then by Laud was, this is the true Catholic Church, saved medievally by England's insular geography from both the errors of Rome and the heresies of Württemberg. And therefore, the only legitimate apostolic succession is in the Church of England. Now, probably like every religious doctrine, it sounds absurd when you state it baldly. You have to have it in a context, right? You could make every religion look silly by stating its premises without any context. But in a way, it's unsurprising that people are kind of attracted, if you like, at both ends to either something more traditional or something more evangelical. Like I say, people have been saying this for a very long time. I think the last time that that Rome and Canterbury was simultaneously empty must have been at the time of William III in the 1690s. So there you go. It doesn't happen very often. Yeah.
First, I want to thank you for your speech today. I think it was probably one of the more pro-American speeches that I've heard from a lot of the speakers I've had at my school. So my question has to deal with sort of intellectual pluralism, and I feel like a lot of people are concerned that intellectual diversity is dying out on college campuses, especially amongst the more elite universities. Is that also the case in the United Kingdom in your experience, from your analysis? And how do you feel like the future of education, higher ed, is going? Is it going in a positive direction, or are we headed towards some sort of area where pluralism is no longer tolerated?
Let's not anyone else line up. Let's take the questions that are here.
That's a good idea. So actually, tell you what, why don't I take, because we've got another 15 minutes or something? Yeah. So why don't I write down your questions, guys, and then I'll come to them. So I'll take them, but let's go back and forth and take a couple more questions, and then I'll give you the answers all at the same time.
Well, I was going to ask, you keep saying that basically we have been able to accept our democracy and the results of these elections for years, but going into actually your point that these problems have existed for a lot longer than we talk about, how do you go with that argument that we are uniquely able to accept the results of our elections when we've actually had some notable examples of them failing, a la Compromise of 1877 or more recently Bush v. Gore?
Okay, thank you. Yep.
Throughout your speech, you gave examples of certain struggles or wars throughout the past 250 years, which have forwarded, these values, and then commanded us to act to continue to forward and enshrine these values. Currently, in what political theater of war or struggle do you see this necessity to act be most at the forefront of, either here, abroad, or internationally?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I have a question about bureaucracy and crime in the Anglosphere. So I think we see this weird phenomenon where law-abiding citizens are starting to be punished, while hardcore criminals are seemingly let loose. So to give you an example, in England, you see a lot of people punished for taking strong stands against immigration, just in terms of speech. But at the same time, you see scandals like the rape gang scandal seemingly covered up. And similarly, in America, to give you an example, in a place like California, you have drugs, you have homelessness, and so on. And these things go on and on and on. But when someone like Xi Jinping comes, it's totally cleaned up. So it seems like the government has the power to address a lot of these problems. But it's like it chooses not to.
Thank you.
And that's what I'm curious your thoughts on.
That's a very good question. Thank you. And then one more on each side, I think. Yeah.
Thank you for the speech. It was great.
Brilliant question. Thank you. And sorry. You're.
But obviously, you supported the UK leaving the European Union, and I assume you support devolved governments in Wales and Scotland, Northern Ireland. But it seems to me you don't support Scottish independence, which I think is somewhat different, but at the same time kind of gives that home rule facet. So is it something that's like, this is good for me, but not for thee, or what's your stance on that?
Sure. And last one.
All right. Do you think it is our duty as inheritors of the Founding Fathers' values, ideals, and documents to reform and improve this nation, adhering not to personal agendas, but to the principle of the Constitution?
Yes. Okay, thank you. I am going to try and get through all of those, so thank you for asking them briefly. It's a discipline for me to try and get through them. So, diversity on campus, and is this happening in the UK? Absolutely. We've got exactly the same issue as here, and for many of the same reasons. My eldest daughter graduated recently from Oxford, and in her college, it was a condition of matriculation initially. They eventually had to drop this under public pressure, that you do a white privilege test, okay? And that you wouldn't be allowed to. I mean, she was doing a languages degree, right? But that you wouldn't be allowed to do a languages degree unless you had gone through this test, where the correct answer to everything was white people are wrong. Now, what's that got to do with a language degree? Well, here's the thing: 200 years ago, in order to do a degree at Oxford or Cambridge, you had, again, the weirdness of the ecclesiastical history of my country. You had to swear an oath repudiating Catholic doctrine, right? You literally, if you wanted to do a degree in languages, you had to say, I swear that the bread and wine used in the Eucharist are only symbolic and are not really the body and blood of our Lord, right? What's that got to do with a French degree? Exactly as much or as little as the white privilege test, right? In both cases, a random value has been sacralized, has been lifted out of its own sphere, and everything else has been subjected to that as the one test of whether you're a good person. We've, if you like, come back to a kind of blasphemy law. Now, in between, we had 200 years of relative freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of inquiry. I'm beginning to wonder whether actually what looked like a paradise of liberal thinking and of freedom was actually just a standoff. That neither of the two sides commanded the heights. That the old Christian Trinity and the new woke Trinity of diversity, equity, inclusion, neither of them was completely able to get its way. And so a measure of individual freedom flourished because of the standoff. Pretty scary thought. And I realize how few are the people, as I say, who care about process, not outcome. When I tell students about when I give that parallel of what my daughter's doing versus what would have happened 200 years ago, the number of people who say, oh, but how can you compare? I mean, one is a really nasty piece of religious bigotry and the other is just about being nice to minorities. If you can't see that it's the same thing, guys, you are in the matrix. Right? If you can't see that in both cases something unrelated to your degree is being made a test of whether you're allowed to be there, you are so deep in the system that you can't stand back and see what the problem is. Have past elections been disputed? Yeah, look, I'm not going to, very good question. I'm not going to argue with that. Election of 1800 was a pretty nasty election. Election of 1860 was a pretty nasty election and worked out pretty badly for a lot of people, right? I wonder whether, though, what can we learn from the relative stability and bipartisanship of the 20th century? What was different about that time that allowed us to have this extraordinary flourishing of wealth and of intellectual diversity? It may actually have been that immigration was managed. So there was a certain homogeneity because the number of people born outside the US was smaller as a result of the controls brought in the 1920s, was smaller in the mid and late 20th century than it's ever been before or since. That meant that basically people had grown up going to the same schools, watching the same TV, watching the same movies, and that gave them a set of shared reference points that made political consensus much easier. Of course, now we are massively diverse, not so much because of immigration, but because we're all following our own separate narratives and watching completely different sets of media. And that, I think, is a real challenge. The average time spent on a TikTok video is 7 seconds. It is much harder to advance an argument that can convince people, especially if it has counterintuitive elements, than it used to be. And if you like, the nature of online discourse, you get the dopamine hits by demonizing the other side and cheerleading your side, not by trying to engage on the basis of reason. So I think that makes the civics all the more important. Which brings me to the question of what is the most important thing. Honestly, it is teaching people what it means to be a citizen. Right? That you are not just a random collection of individuals born to a different random collection of individuals, that you, wherever your parents were from, you are Americans, and that carries a series of rights and responsibilities, and that's what makes you behave well to one another. Right? It really shouldn't be seen as controversial or partisan, and it is a sad thing that it has fallen to organizations like TFAS to do that job, that there shouldn't need to be a job outside the education system to be done. Right? That should be something that we're all getting from the moment we go to school, to junior school. Really tough question about why does Britain police everything except crime? Right? Why do we get more upset? I mean, this is a real issue. Yeah? One of the things I'm very proud of in my country is that until now, we had a really excellent relationship between the police and everybody else, certainly much more than here. And the reason for that is that the policeman was a citizen in uniform with no more powers than you or me, except insofar as he had those powers contingently bestowed on him by a magistrate for a particular purpose. Right? That's why they're not armed. That's why they don't have any extra stop and search powers or anything else. Right? And that worked really well as long as they were seen to belong to the country as a whole. It's like jury service. The police are kind of part of us, not part of a state that's imposing its will, as was the case in a lot of Europe. And the real danger of arresting people because you don't like their opinions, or of treating them differently because you don't like their opinions, is that the policeman becomes a uniformed agent of state ideology, and that relationship is gone. And we are perilously close to that moment. And I'm afraid we're seeing again the difficulty that people have of caring about process when they favor a particular outcome. So in your question, you gave the examples of people being arrested and indeed in one notorious case imprisoned for expressing pretty nasty views, but nonetheless views in an online forum about immigration or about multiculturalism. We then just had last week a couple of cases of rap musicians, if you like, inciting, but from the other political direction. A group called Kneecap from Belfast, who at a concert was saying, "Kill your MP. If you've got a Conservative MP, kill him," which, is arguably incitement. And then there was a show a couple of days ago at Glastonbury, the guys who have just been banned from coming into this country, a group called Bob Villain, who are a pair of guys who are both, one's called Bobby Villain and one's called Bobby Villain, spelt differently. And of course, they come from perfectly comfortable middle-class homes in Ipswich, and but like all these rappers, right? But they were leading this chant of death, death to the IDF, or in their dialect, deaf, deaf, which kind of rhymes, deaf, deaf to the IDF, as though, you know, in favor of hearing impaired people joining the Israeli armed forces. Now, in my view, all of that stops short of actual incitement. Because for me, I would set the bar very high at incitement. You have to show that there is a real intention of inciting somebody. And the idea that a stoned attendee of Glastonbury is going to jump on the next flight to Ben Gurion and attack the first IDF person because of that cry, I think is implausible, right? But the usual free speech absolutists, because it's on the other side, the ones who are the most upset about people being imprisoned for what they said about immigration or the Southport riots, are saying, oh, well, now you've got to lock these guys up as well. Well, how about this? How about a world where we don't really lock anyone up because of expressing an opinion, unless it actually crosses the line? For me, incitement is saying, why don't we all go around to so-and-so's house and, smash his windows? And people do it, right? That's an actual case of incitement. Right? Me behind my window, or behind my steering wheel in frustration saying, why doesn't somebody kill the guy driving that Mercedes? That is not incitement. I may have used the word, but I'm not expecting anyone to go and, tie a weight around his ankles and throw him into the sea, right? So we need to, I think, we need to err on the side of privacy and on the side of freedom, and we are a very long way away from that. I'm going to rush through this, but the point about Scotland and Brexit and self-determination. Look, self-determination means exactly that, right? People can self-determine to be part of a bigger unit or not. So the short answer is I was strongly in favour of having referendums on both issues, and I was strongly in favour of upholding the results of both referendums. Had Scotland voted for independence, I wouldn't have questioned that for a second. Had Britain voted to stay in the EU, I wouldn't have questioned that for a second. By the way, this makes the United Kingdom a quite unusual country, in that there is no problem with secession. There's no law against it. There's no issue. Anyone can say, we've had enough. We want to leave. Having waxed lyrical about your constitution, I will allow that there was one quite major flaw in it, which is that although it went into tremendous detail in one or two things, like specifying that you need 2 witnesses in a treason trial, it left open the question of whether you were allowed to secede from the Union. And that lacuna led to some problems further down the line. But actually, in the UK, that wouldn't arise. It is implicit that if you had a majority and you had a referendum behind it, you could walk out. But people can also self-determine to belong to a bigger unit. And plainly, a majority of people in Scotland, when they were polled, felt that they had enough in common as Brits that they wanted that bigger part of the identity. And I think that is, self-determination is not the same as secession. It means actually respecting the democratic result. And I think, I can't remember what the last question was. It was about, sorry, it was your question. It was about, to shout it from where you are. Remind me what it was.
Yeah, do you think it is our duty as inheritors of the Founding Fathers' values, ideals, and documents to reform and improve this nation, adhering not to personal agendas, but to the principles of the Constitution?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I think the biggest criticism I have of a number of recent presidents, but not least the present incumbent, is this: that they do not exhibit any strong awareness that they are passing through institutions that are bigger than they are. And that, for me, is a kind of entry-level requirement if you want that job. Now, one of the weird hobbies I have is I like to visit the houses of various presidents. The first time that I spoke at this organization was in 2010 at Monticello. And I think I've probably been to a couple of dozen of them. Some of them you really get a sense of the character. Monticello being one, the restless and comprehensive genius of Jefferson. Calvin Coolidge's house. What a modest upbringing and what a modest man. Ronald Reagan, his ranch outside Santa Barbara. I've never seen a politician's house with fewer reminders of the status of the occupant. All the others that I've been in, you've got photographs of the guy or girl with kings and popes and presidents. This was a little house that he'd built with his own hands with a collection of cowboy novels. And as I walked through it, I thought, this is what the founders really wanted. This was the ideal of a citizen president who couldn't wait to get away from this city and go back and get on his horse and be an ordinary citizen, right? Now, I don't want to intrude into present politics, but I think we are some way from that at the moment. And I would love to restore that sense, right? That your oath of office is not just a pro forma form of words. It's a serious and important commitment to uphold the most successful constitution on the planet. And all of you, by the way, all of you can play a part in this because you can make it clear that you're going to vote for the people who think that whatever party they're in, you want people who believe in the letter and spirit of the Constitution, the localism, the dispersal of power, the elevation of process over outcome, etc. Like I say, in a democracy, we get the leaders we deserve. And if people just want to mobilize state power against people that they don't like, well, they're going to get leaders who do that for them. So thank you all very much. Please don't think me rude, and I can't even call it a democracy because I'm in the unelected upper house, but I do have to get back for a really important vote. So I'm going to tear off to Dulles Airport now. But thank you and enjoy the rest of the program.
Well, everybody, thank you for listening, and we pray and hope that you have a great 4th of July to celebrate our country's independence. Have a good night. Take care.